Welcome to the Learning Ideas Conference's February winter event interviews. And I'm here with Imogen Casebourne, who is the Research Innovation Lead at DEFI, the Digital Education Futures Initiative at Cambridge. And Imogen, it's great to see you again, as always.
Great to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Great. Well, one of the things I know you've been experimenting with, and I can kind of get right into it, is generative AI, and particularly ChatGPT, which is a major topic of conversation these days and a major participant in conversations with people all around the world. So I'd love to hear about your experience and what you've been experimenting with and playing around with.
Yes, well, like many people, I started to see a lot of conversations about ChatGPT around Christmas. And so I thought I would do some experimenting with it. I've always been interested in this area. I wrote a computer program that wrote short stories when I was studying AI way back. so I'm quite interested in the way these types of programs work. So I was playing around with it, and I was intrigued to find that it creates false references. So,
that's always an interesting thing. I've read a little bit about this. So for you asked it to write some kind of research summary, and it simply made up the references. Is that an accurate summary, or the way it appeared to you? Obviously, it's not consciously making them up, but they were inaccurate references. Were they papers that did not exist at all, or were they just simply not relevant to what it was really saying?
So it was fascinating. So I thought I would ask it to co-write the blog with me and sort of show the bits that it had contributed and what I'd contributed and how it could be used as a creative aid. I was actually thinking of writing a blog about how it could be used to generate worked examples. So I was thinking back to when I was learning statistics and how I really wanted to see lots of different worked examples so that I could understand the good and bad. And I thought, well, ChatGPT might be great at this. So let's play with this. And that was the blog piece I meant to write. But I thought I'd get it to write a general introduction to the concept of AI and education. And it wrote me quite a nice little introduction. And I thought, that's great, but let's get it to talk about its sources. So I said, please provide a list of references. And it produced a beautiful looking list of very, very, they look like real references. And in fact, some of them were real, but not all of them. And some of them were references to people who were experts in the field, but they hadn't written those papers in those journals. And they were real journals and real people, but not real papers. And then some of them were people who wrote in completely different areas. So it was, an interesting mixed bag.
That's really something. So were any of the references accurate and real at all?
So I then started playing with it, and generally speaking, none of them were, but every now and again it would throw in a few real ones. So I tried to get it to generate various references on various topics. And then I asked it, ChatGPT, are these real references? And it said, yes, these are real references to genuine journal articles, but they weren't. And then I asked it to write an introduction to the topic of ChatGPT potentially making up fake references. And I gave it one of its reference lists and said, you refer to this in the article. And then it was able to distinguish the real and the false ones. So it's interesting. And, I think it's, it's giving you the statistic, what it thinks is the statistically most likely response. But obviously, sometimes these are not genuine papers, which is,
Yeah, no, that's really something. So, I guess, right, part of what a lot of what it's doing is generating text from piecing it together from various places. So do you think what's happening here is it's piecing together things from various places without being appropriately aware of the connections that need to be made? Like, this is an author, this is a paper, but this is not a paper by that author. And so therefore this is simply inaccurate the way it's portrayed.
It may be doing that. Sometimes it's not even a paper at all, I think. It's not a paper by any author, but I thought it would be an interesting way of coming up with good titles for our own papers, because it's coming up with what it thinks are the statistically most likely titles on this topic. So if you've written a paper and you're wondering what to call it, I think ChatGPT could be a real help there, because you could just ask it to generate some likely looking references.
So now, in terms of how you see this being useful, so were there ways in which ChatGPT was actually useful to you in a way that you could feel was more easily testable and reliable? Like, what, like, I guess the question is, did it really help you at all, and could it really help you at all? So those are actually two questions.
Yeah, so I had it summarize articles that I'd written, and that was quite useful. I wanted it to, help me create a presentation by summarizing bits of an article so I could start making slides. So that was helpful. It can make pretty nice summaries. And I was interested, I saw on LinkedIn someone who writes e-learning courses, and she had taken she'd taken some subject content, I think, from a subject expert, and fed it into ChatGPT and asked it to design an e-learning course, and it had done so. But she showed it to the subject matter expert, and they said, well, it's a bit shallow. So I think if you think of the sort of the Guildford things, generative, fluent, is it fluent? Is it, elaborative? Is it flexible? I think it's fluent, but maybe not very elaborative. It doesn't go into sufficient depth. It's very surface. But she was also saying that it created really good plausible distractors. So if you're trying to write MCQs and you want to come up with plausible distractors, she was finding that ChatGPT was quite helpful there. But of course, it made me wonder, well, maybe, soon we won't need plausible distractors, because we can have AI, assess open input text. And so that might completely change the way those types of e-learning courses were designed, which is an interesting thought, I think. In preparation for this chat, I asked ChatGPT to create a course on creativity and learning design for me. So I asked it what we should be looking at, and it sort of suggested that we introduce some examples of creative thinking, and then introduce techniques, and that perhaps we should have some multiple choice role playing and some case studies. And then I said, well, what novel technologies might we use? And it said, well, we could use VR, and people could enter an immersive virtual world, and they could see, like going into a museum, I guess, they could see examples of these creative things to start with, and then there could be mind mapping tools. And so it had some things to say on the topic. And then I asked it, about look and feel. And I gave it various audiences. I said, well, imagine this is for business executives, or imagine this is for primary school children. And I asked it to come up with a unifying metaphor to bring the whole course together. And for the business executives, it said, think of creativity as being like a business plan. You have to do some research. And so it's sort of, I don't know, it sort of came up with ideas, but I found them a bit hackneyed, really. But yeah, interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, at least in the way that you're using it there, it's, the power dynamic, so to speak, is clearly set that, like, you're using it for suggestions, you're going to take it to the next level, right? Which is very different, I think, from the way that people are, well, it's certainly that higher education organizations, higher education institutions fear the people who use it, which is just, generate this and I will say this is, my end product.
Yeah.
And exactly.
Yeah.
And so those are really different things. How did that feel in terms of being able to produce a finished product that was more than entertainment? Like, I mean, I know I've seen, discuss, write a short story about, the current political climate in the form of a Bob Dylan song, and it can do that, and that's really fun, and everybody passes it around, right? But in terms of things that are a little bit more practical, did you see it being able to produce anything of value yet, more than in the ways that you've used it? Like, give me some ideas, and maybe I'll take some, maybe I won't.
Yeah, I think it's at that. I think it's more at that level. There's a guy called Ethan Mollick who's been doing some quite interesting things in course and learning design with it. He asked it to create an introduction to, I think, the business studies, and it came up with a sort of undergraduate course and a reading list with real books in this case. So I think it has some benefits. And what I asked it to do with the statistics course, I said, come up with a data set and then come up with an example of how that's been done, and then come up with examples, come up with a grading system. So, and then come up with examples at each grade level. So like a response that would get 80%, a response that would get 60%, a response that would, get 20%. So it immediately did all of that for me, which, because that's the problem, isn't it? Sometimes generating enough worked examples for someone who's struggling with the concept, they can perhaps look at different examples and different models until something clicks into place. And quite often we're only offered a single example, and that may be fine for some people, but not for others. And that takes time, it takes time to generate these things, and particularly poor examples, because you don't want to use genuine people's work. So you kind of need a fake poor example. So I think that's quite useful. The only problem is that it makes mistakes. So even the example it thinks are correct, you need to check them pretty hard to make sure it hasn't made an error. So I don't know exactly how it's generating those things, but I think there's real potential in making examples, which is, a time-consuming and not particularly interesting thing to create, that it could go off and do for you, perhaps.
Yeah, and I can certainly see a role where it would, it's sort of taking the, the more rote work away from people. It's funny because we're talking about it as, it's generative, it's creative, and so we're talking about it as a, producer of creative things, but it feels like maybe the ideal role is for it to produce things that help people who are producing creative things to take some of the, the less creative parts, and the like labor intensive parts away and help them there. So that's, it's a really interesting thing. The accuracy concerns still seem to be an issue. Like, it feels like there's one school of thought to say, look, when it has more data, everything will be fine. And there's another school of thought, and I think I personally tend toward the latter at the moment, which is, well, there's a lot of things to worry about here in terms of, it's not so easy to just say, well, when there's more data, everything will be fine. I'm not sure that's worked for us in anything else all that well to this point, looking around the world that we live in. So are there things that you might have run across that you think we should, be aware of as things progress, and to try to turn this into something that's maybe more practically useful in more wider cases in a reliable way?
Yeah, well, I think one thing with the worked examples, while you can't rely on it to get them quite right yet, what you can do is just have it create a whole bunch of examples and then take them to your class and have your class activity be checking them out and seeing how accurate they are. So, even with the current inaccuracy, it could still help you make those materials and generate the conversation and have people look at examples and work out what it's got right and what it's got wrong, which I think could still be, I think it could be useful there in itself. But yeah, I was kind of wondering, because we have AI now, it plays chess, it does Go, you have things like Midjourney and DALL-E that do painting, you have storytelling, but I want an AI assistant that will do the boring stuff so that I can focus on the creativity. So
no, and that's funny, because that's also a lot of my view of technology and where it really should play a role. And it's certainly interesting to see these other things, and they may have a role. But ideally, it is allowing us to be more human and not less human. And instead of sometimes it gets turned around, and it's our entire lives are, well, let me understand this system, and it takes longer to understand the system than it would have been to would have taken to do it sort of another way, and it's not helping take the load off you. So there's certainly something in that there. Well, great. Well, and in terms of time, it's probably a good time to wrap up. Is there anything else that you think, based on your experience with ChatGPT and some of these other things, that, you'd want people to know, you think people should sort of, think about as they look forward and look ahead to where these tools may go and how they may use them?
Well, I think, a lot of creativity, I think, happens in groups and in teams. Design creativity, it comes from people bouncing ideas off people. You have someone who's got visual expertise and someone who has expertise in the subject area and someone who has design expertise. So, that's a lot for an AI to take on. So I wonder if we'll hopefully in the future see more AI that helps people to work in groups, that helps people to bring people together, and helps perhaps to orchestrate that group process, which could be quite interesting, as well as acting as an individual assistant.
Fantastic. Well, there's a lot of interesting stuff coming up, and a lot to experiment and play around with. And it's great talking to you about all of this, and always interesting to hear what you're working on. So thanks for spending the time talking with me today.
Thank you for inviting me.